As I said last week, Mozart was beset with a number of troubles in the 3 years up to his final year. A lot of his performances and performance opportunities dropped off, partly at least because of the Ottoman-Austrian War, which was raging at the time, in which the Ottoman Turks got very, very close to Vienna. And in addition, it became more difficult for him to get commissions, and so he ran up a number of debts, and that seems to have affected his productivity. But in his final year, even though he was only healthy for the first 8 months, he wrote his final string quintet, his final piano concerto, his clarinet quintet and clarinet concerto, his little Masonic cantata, 2 of his great operas, La Clemenza di Tito and The Magic Flute, Die Zauberflöte, and then some or most of his Requiem. We're going to listen today, and so far at least the internet is fine. We are going to listen to the clarinet concerto, rather, and all of the Requiem. The big event, or one of the big events for Mozart in his last about 3 years, was his meeting Anton Stadler, who was a clarinetist, apparently a very good one because of the level of music that Mozart wrote for him. And Mozart got so excited about the clarinet that he wrote it into 2 of his last 3 symphonies. He wrote a trio for clarinet, viola, and piano. He wrote a clarinet quintet, and he wrote his clarinet concerto, all of those for Stadler. Now, Stadler also played an older version of the clarinet, which is kind of equivalent to the modern alto clarinet, called the basset horn, and he played a conglomerate instrument called the basset clarinet. And that's what he wrote his clarinet concerto for. Now, the issue with that is that it's a longer instrument with, it has 4 extra semitones at the bottom of its register. And the problem if you're playing on a modern A clarinet is that those passages that include this have to be transposed up an octave, which leads to some awkwardness that is not in the original. So the way that has gotten around today is that a lot of clarinetists have newly constructed instruments that are modeled on the basset clarinet that have those extra low notes. So when you see our clarinetists today, and those of you who were here last week, I actually have a bit of a surprise because I've chosen a different performance from the one I had last week. You will see that Sabine Meyer is playing a longer than usual clarinet. And you'll hear by the richness of the low notes that she actually has those available to her. This is a work in 3 movements, and you would think with my last name Nielsen that I would opt for the performance with the Danish Radio Symphony and Martin Fröst, but instead I'm choosing Sabine Meyer, who has been one of my favorite clarinetists and who really introduced me to Mozart clarinet playing. It's one of her specialties. And so what we were going to see is the opening few minutes of the first movement and then all of the last 2 movements. And this is with the a chamber group of the Bayerischer Rundfunk, the Bavarian Radio Orchestra, with whom I actually played for 1 rehearsal in 1976. I was studying percussion at the Orff Institute in Salzburg, and they needed extra percussionists for a composer, 4th Symphony. This composer you've probably never heard of, Karl Amadeus Hartmann, late 19th and up to mid-20th century composer, one of the few Austrian or German composers to stand up to the Nazis in the 1930s and 40s. And this work was programmed, and we went, so I was invited along with another student to come in and play, and I was playing bass drum and woodblock, and you think, oh, it's just boom, chick, boom. No, it was a hard part. And I'd never played this piece before. I had a recording, so I worked on it, and I really practiced and really practiced and really practiced, and then we got there, and the conductor was Raphael Kubelik, and we played through it, and I missed a whole bunch of my entrances, because being surrounded by the orchestra was very different from listening on the recording, and I just... we drove home. This was in Munich. We drove back to Salzburg. The next day we drove in, and we got there, and they were taking the pieces off the stands and putting a Mahler symphony on the stands. Part of the problem was it wasn't my fault. The rehearsal was not going, the piece was not coming together quickly. And Kubelik said it was really killing his bursitis in his shoulder as he was conducting. So the Mahler was easier, so they took it. So I never got a chance to correct my mistake. I felt badly until a couple of months later when I was back in the United States and the check arrived for my playing. And, you know, for one day's work in 1976, getting $140 for that was, they paid really well. So anyway, that's my story about the Bayerischer Rundfunk. It was an all-male band in those days, except for my colleague, who was a Japanese woman who was playing another percussion instrument. But in this group, you'll see it's a much younger, more balanced male-female ensemble. So in any case, here's the opening. Hello. There we go. Now, if you look carefully, I don't know how familiar you are with clarinets, but you'll see it's probably about an extra 6 inches on this instrument. It's quite a large, long clarinet. If you hear all that imitation of the lines going from part to part, you can tell how well he's learned counterpoint by this point. Lovely, huh? Standard clarinet comes to about, well, wait, about here. It's wonderful, but I'm going to move on to the second movement, which is absolutely heavenly. You'll notice that this is a conductorless group, so it's kind of like the Orpheus Chamber Orchestra, or closer to home, a far cry, the string orchestra in Boston. And the concertmaster, with his wonderful smiling face, is leading from the first stand. All right, second movement. You hear those low notes?
Those are the notes.
Yeah. Now, this is all ornamentation. This is all like a cadenza, and she's made it up. takes a great player to play as softly as she did on the return to the main melody. things I like about this performance is that the orchestra is quite small, 20, which is kind of standard for a chamber orchestra, 4 of each first and second violins, 3 violas, 2 cellos, 1 bass, then 2 each of flute, bassoon, and horn. And when they played forte, there was plenty of sound, but it allowed them to play softly, and for her to play softly and to sound as delicate as they did in those soft places. Another thing to note is there was one place near the end where she does a run, and she does it in 3 different octaves, where she's going up, and she does it up in the 3rd octave. That's not possible on the modern clarinet. You would have to transpose some of that. And so there were a lot of advantages to being able to play on this hybrid instrument. And I think since he wrote this in October, when he was already ill, it proves once again my point that it is never safe to compare the external circumstances of an artist's life with the inner life of that artist that produces a work of art, be it visual art or written or piece of music. Because although during October he seemed to be holding his own, he was still ill. He fell ill first on September 6th, and he was able to conduct the premiere of Die Zauberflöte on the 30th, and then he fell ill again, seriously ill, on the 20th of November, and from then on it was a very quick decline, and he died on early in the morning of December 5th. But he wrote this when he was obviously not at his best physically, and yet it's so effervescent, especially the outer movements. And the second movement is so beautiful and soulful that it's, you know, hard to believe that this was a person who would be dead in less than 2 months. Sometime during that year, he had received an emissary from Count Franz von Walsegg, who commissioned a requiem mass for his wife from Mozart. His wife had died in February, and he liked, forgive me for repeating myself from last week, but I think it bears repeating, that he liked to pass compositions that were written for him off as his own at private house concerts. And so the whole myth of, you know, the mysterious stranger coming and commissioning this, and Mozart thinking it was a requiem for his own death, was actually something that was put about by Mozart's widow after his death as a way of enhancing the mystique of the work. So because of his opera commissions and other things he was working on, he really couldn't get started on it until sometime in November, by which time he was ill. And so as a result, even though he wrote at a feverish pace, even when he was confined to his bed, he did not get further than the first 8 bars of the Lacrimosa, which is the final movement of the sequence, which is the 3rd section of the Requiem Mass. There's the introit, there's the Kyrie, and then there's the sequence, which has a number of movements in it. It has the Dies Irae, and then the Tuba Mirum, then Confutatis, then I've sung it, I ought to know it. Oh, sorry, it's the Dies Irae, Tuba Mirum, Rex Tremende, and then the Recordare, the Confutatis, and then the Lacrimosa. And he had completed the scoring completely all the way through the end of the Kyrie. And then he had really very full sketches for everything up through the final 8 bars, or the first 8 bars of the Lacrimosa. After that, as I said last week, probably 24 composers have tried to complete the Requiem in a somewhat different way from the way his former student, Franz Süssmayr, who'd been asked by Constanze to finish it, from the way that he completed it. And because of all the things that Constanze put about afterwards, trying to convince people that almost all of the Requiem was in fact Mozart's, because it would increase its value to publishers, it would create income through concerts, because people would much rather go to see a Requiem that had been the final work of Mozart as long as it was Mozart's, and also to make sure that she got the final payment for the commission. So she put about all sorts of stories that then got turned into other stories, like the one that I told you about last week, where Pushkin took this rumor that Salieri had helped Mozart and turned it into a play, Mozart and Salieri, which then became an opera by Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov. So this mystery and all of these conflicting stories happened long before the play Amadeus. What we are going to see is a newer version of the Requiem, which was completed probably in the 1970s by Robert Levin, basing it on new evidence. In the 1960s, an Amen showed up that was positively identified, number one, as Mozart's, and number two, almost all scholars agreed that it actually belonged at the end of the Lacrimosa, because that sequence does end with an Amen, but Süssmayer's is extremely short. This one is much more elaborate, and in fact has a link in its theme to the theme of the Kyrie. So you'll hear that in this, and you'll also hear some other changes if you're used to the Süssmayer version, which I am because I've known it all my life, and have sung it a number of times. So this is different, and it's quite exciting. It's a very exciting performance. And so I will jump up at the appropriate moment and say, he stopped here. And then it's a pretty hair-raising moment in the music anyway. But other than that, I will try to keep my comments to a minimum. And I love the National Youth Chorus of Scotland. They are so fresh-faced, and their diction is superb. Hang on. I want to enjoy this too. So I'm turning off my air conditioner over here, just because it makes a lot of noise. Ah. All right. Here we go. Mozart uses basset horns on this rather than clarinets. They're deeper sound. And when you see them, you'll see that they're modern instruments.
Oh,
See the bend in the clarinets? They're larger than usual. We come to the Kyrie. Mozart swiped the theme directly from the second part of Messiah. And with his stripes we are healed. Same theme, different key. Wow, this is fast. Now, there's a little portative organ there that you can see that's playing along with this. Notice how the music is sinking as he's going down onto his knees, the supplicant. One transition chord. Mozart stopped right there. This is where it's different from the Süssmayr edition. Now that Hosanna is longer than in the Süssmayr version. It's a lot more satisfying too. Orchestration's a little different in this too. That's different too. It's a much gentler version because in the Süssmayr version, it's trombones do the yum, bum, bum, bum part. This is also different. So this is a return to material from the beginning. wait. Sorry?
What great hall is that? And who was the statue in gold at the head of the...
That is Sir Arthur Wood, and that is in the...
Isn't it Albert Hall?
Yeah. And these are the the Royal Albert Hall, and these are the BBC Proms, which is one of my life's wishes, to go to one of these concerts.
I actually went to one in utero. My mother told the story about climbing up to a seat in the gods and feeling as though she was going to fall off. She was 7 months pregnant with me.
Oh, so you were there, but you don't remember.
Right, exactly. But I felt it.
Right.
That's good fun.
One of the things that I love about watching choruses, and particularly a well-trained youth chorus, is their absolute and total commitment. And unlike the orchestra, they can look directly at the conductor. So you get to see them expressing the music, whereas for the instrumentalists, they either have something in their mouth or they have to move someplace, and so it's more difficult. But I just thought that was such a wonderful performance by everybody. I also thought it was really interesting. I don't know whether you noticed, but almost all the first violins were women. That is the BBC Scotland Orchestra, and I think that, and I mean this is just guesswork on my part, but I'd be very surprised if this weren't a life-changing experience for a lot of those choristers.
Yeah.
I mean, to have something like that, I mean, that just gets seared into your brain and your being, doing something like that. It's such a large work, and it's such a profound work, and it's such a tremendous communal experience. Having that, and you know, those of us who've sung this work or other great works like this know what it's like as adults. But if you're 17 years old, I mean, it's just a mind-blowing experience to be in that. And so, and you could just see on their faces, there are a number of the sopranos who were just, their eyes were open the whole time. And also some of the tenors. And the thing I like, I'm a tenor, so I can say this. The thing I like about tenors is there's almost no ceiling to how high their eyebrows go. You know, they just get higher and higher and higher. So it's just ecstatic. And you know, and when you've got tenor and you've got all those high notes, it's great. But this is, in a lot of ways, a very eye-opening experience for me, or ear-opening experience, I should say, because this is a work that I really have literally known for 60 years. And to have these differences in orchestration, these differences, particularly adding that amen, and also the changes so that, for instance, there's an Hosanna fugue, which in the Süssmayr is actually quite unsatisfying because it just gets going and then it stops. Whereas here, it's much more substantial. And to have those changes makes it a much broader experience, because I've always felt that the first half, and this might be just psychological, knowing that that the second half is questionable in terms of its provenance, how much of it is Mozart and how much isn't. And knowing that the first half is definitely Mozart, I always felt that there was a little sort of a tail off until you get to the final movement, which is just the first, the Kyrie fugue, but with different words. This seems to add a lot more substance to that second half. And so, and with a spectacular performance like this, although I felt sorry for the alto trombonist, who spent a great deal of the time just sitting there. Yeah. She didn't get to play much at all. And I'm not quite sure why that is. It does call for 3 trombones, but usually an alto trombone part these days can be handled by a tenor trombonist. It's just in the upper register, unless the conductor is really finicky about the difference in timbre between the two instruments. But anyway, yes, Diane.
Is the size of that chorus is that a standard size? Is it
that's a great question. And the answer is, I'm glad you brought it up. The answer is, for a performance like this in the Royal Albert Hall, this is something you need so that the people in the, I won't say the cheap seats because there aren't any, but the people behind the chorus who are sitting there get a great experience too. This is standard for a Verdi Requiem performance because that calls for enormous forces. I've seen choruses maybe an eighth of the size of this do this, and a much smaller orchestra, and you know, period instruments and things like that. It's a much lighter performance, but I would say in this situation, you know, it's a pretty electrifying sound. Those fortissimos are, you know, reach everywhere, and I think it's really exciting. There's something, you know, it used to be that having a chorus this size was standard for something like Messiah, when Handel wrote it for a much smaller group, and now you get groups that are much more agile doing it, and you get a lot more of the dance aspect of a piece like Messiah. With this, I think you can make a case either way. As long as a chorus this size has good diction and is light on its feet, you can bring it off, and they sure did. I mean, every final consonant was just bing, right there in the forehead. You could feel it. Were fantastic. So they had a tremendous range, and doing those runs, it wasn't something where they were slurring over them. You could hear all the notes in them, and you know, he took very brisk tempi in a lot of this. The fugues, in particularly for the Kyrie and the finale, were really fast, and they handled it. So,
Did Mozart choose the words that were to be?
well, they were standard from the Requiem Mass, from the Latin Mass for the dead.
It's a standard Latin Mass, or is it
For the dead.
by the Catholic Church?
Yes. So you can find Requiem Masses that go back to the 13th century. You know, so the words are the same. If you listen to the Verdi Requiem, for instance, there's more to it at the end in terms of the words. Mozart sort of gets through it. If, on the other hand, you listen to Stravinsky's Requiem canticles, which he wrote when he was in his mid-80s after he'd had a stroke, the words get basically spat out in a row at the end because he was running out of energy. It's a great work, but it's 15 minutes long. So it's a much shorter work. But yes, the words are standard. What I thought was interesting was that they did this in Italianate Latin, suscipe. Had it been done in Vienna, it would have been suscipe, German Latin. So, and French Latin would be different, and English Latin, which is also different. It's the received wisdom today is that that Latin is pronounced in the manner that such letters would be pronounced in the country in which you are performing it, or in the country in which it was written. But a lot of times this is done in Italianate Latin because that's what a lot of groups are used to. But if you listen to something like Bach's Magnificat, sung by a group that does it in Italianate Latin and a German group, there's a vast difference in pronunciation. So instead of quia fecit mihi magna, you will hear quia ficit mihi magna. It's a much harder sound. The Italians have a much softer way with consonants. So anyway, folks, that's all there is. There ain't no more. But I really enjoyed this class. I hope you have a wonderful summer. I hope to see you in the fall when I talk about Bach.